Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today, at long last, after over 3 years, we've come basically to the end of my coverage for The Wheel of Time. There is still some video ideas that I have to cover this series to some extent, at some point in the future, one particular video, which I will talk about at the end of this one. I'll mention that I am looking to do at some point later in the year, but for now, this is essentially the close of my primary coverage of The Wheel of Time, my personal experience with it, and everything that comes with that 3-year-long journey now. It has certainly been a wild one. For the purposes of today's video, I will admit it actually took me way too long to determine what this video would actually encompass, because I was considering for a long time making this both my ranking personally of the series as well as a form of collective one, and that's something that we'll talk a little bit more about at the end of this video, discussing like what the internet's ranking of the series would be and stuff like that. That idea was born from considerations involved with the existence of the slog, quote unquote, whether or not that actually exists, as well as some other similar types of topics of discussion. If you've been a reader of The Wheel of Time or discussed it to any degree, you know probably exactly what all of that stuff is about. But in the end, I just kind of decided that that would be a little bit too much for this video, so I will be separating that. And again, we'll talk about it a little bit more later. So what does this video actually entail, you might ask? Well, thankfully, the answer to that question is pretty simple. Let me line up the 3 parts that this video will be made up in real quick and easy. The first part of this will be starting off with a tier list for The Wheel of Time, which will be, to some degree, to some extent, in some sense, I suppose, a little bit more objective, quote unquote. To be clear, it's still very much based on my opinion and my experience, and so it's not going to line up with literally anybody else's pretty much at all. And there's also the fact that my tier list is pretty much inherently constructed after a star rating based system where each of the ranks, I'll explain them when we switch over to the tier list in a moment. Each one of them is basically represented by a certain range of star ratings, and so there is that personal subjectivity of my experience involved with it. So some of the placements will still hurt people. It is, again, my list, but it is, relatively speaking, a little bit more balanced by how I personally feel the quality of each book actually stacks up within the context of all the rest. The second part of this video, however, will be talking about a much more subjective ranking that is actually just straight up ranking the book from 15 up through number 1. And again, it's still going to be my list. It's still going to be very subjective. But this time, basically, nobody is going to be happy with the list at all, not even a little bit, because in the tier list, I try to acknowledge some manner of objectivity, like I said, with the star ratings and stuff. I try to stack up each book in the context of how I feel it performs on what it's trying to compared to other books, whereas the list is more or less just working off of my taste, like literally nothing besides how much I enjoyed each book. And sure, the star ratings are going to correspond to that, but that's where the third part of this video is going to come in. Speaking of the differences between the tier list and the actual list, I'm going to actually be comparing those two more or less implicitly, but in the third section, I'll be explicitly lining them up next to each other, basically as a list somewhere that I'll put on the screen probably or something. Not 100% sure how I'm going to do it, but I'll basically be closing by comparing those actual rankings side by side to showcase where the major differences are, as well as the minor ones, but particularly interesting that will be to see there are a couple spots here that are a little bit surprising to me in some sense between the two different versions of the list, we shall say. But anyway, the different standards for those two different rankings do yield different results, even just one person covering the same series and thinking about it in two different ways. And so, my takes about the series are very out there, all things considered, but that is basically what this video is going to entail, is those three sections: the tier list, the more regular ranking, and then comparing the two of them side by side. With a huge series like this, it's no surprise that there are probably going to be some interesting little nuances and stuff in there. We will go ahead and get started with my ranking by switching over to the desktop for the tier list portion of it. And as you can see, I have 5 different categories here for the tier list: Tavern, Dragonsworn, White Cloaks, Dark Friends, and the Dark One. These should be pretty self-explanatory, and they are a little bit gimmicky, I admit, but this is basically the rules that I followed for the list. Actually, let me pull it up because I didn't actually write this in my notes for some reason. It's just in a DM that I have with one of my buddies. The top rank here, Tavern, is basically the equivalent to the S tier. Obviously, that's pretty self-explanatory. These aren't necessarily defined by any particular star rating, but they are my 3 favorite books of the series, which kind of makes sense. If you know the 3 primary Tavern from the series, that's the reason that S tier is going to be ranked by itself, is my 3 favorite books in the series are going to be ranked here over and above everything else. The next tier, Dragonsworn, is our A tier. That is going to encompass the remainder of the 4.5 and 5-star ratings that I gave different books in the series. B tier, White Cloaks, kind of in between the light and the dark, depending on the part of the series you're in, funny enough, is going to be the basically the 4-star books. So, books that I think are good, but not like really crossing the threshold into being great, in my opinion. They're obviously 4 stars. 4 stars is still very good rating. My average rating for the entire series is just above 4 stars. So this tier is not bad. It's just, all things considered, average for all intents and purposes for the series. Dark Friends, again, pretty self-explanatory. That's where we start to get to me liking the stuff a little bit less, or there otherwise being some degree of fundamental problems with them that holds them back for me to some degree. These are going to be basically all of the books that are rated anything below 4 stars are going to go under Dark Friends. So again, 3.5-star book can still end up in Dark Friends. That doesn't mean that I necessarily dislike that book. In fact, there's only one book in the series that I would say crosses the threshold into me actively disliking it, and that is what the Dark One category is for at the bottom. This is our D tier, F tier, whatever you want to call it. It's my least favorite book of the series. It is the Dark One, the one book that is the exception to the rest of the series, the one that I can, without too much hesitation, say that I basically dislike, whereas all of the others I either enjoy quite a bit, or really like, or love. All of that said, let's go ahead and actually start the tier list now with Eye of the World, the very first book in the series, which I will be putting in the Dragonsworn tier, which may or may not be a hot take. Eye of the World has a certain reputation that comes with it, primarily as a result of it being, a classic fantasy novel of the time in which it was written, i.e. it was taking a lot of inspiration from Tolkien. Now, I personally believe that the Tolkien comparison of Eye of the World are supremely overblown, and I really like this book on its own terms, but the really liking the book on its own terms is the reason that I put it in Dragonsworn. It's not just to be an apologist or anything, but because I genuinely really, really liked that book. It was a book that I went into reading kind of more or less expecting it to be like a 3-star, maybe 3.5-star book, and then I come out of it rating it basically 5. It was like a 4.5, I believe, is what I actually gave it. I really, really like Eye of the World. I think it's a fantastic introduction for the world, for our main characters, for the primary conflict of stuff that's going down, and I thought that the entire thing was very compellingly written, outside of one chapter, which had some weird structural things going on that didn't actually make any sense at all. But outside of that, and the fact that the climax is a little bit sudden and doesn't make a whole ton of sense on a first read through, I genuinely really enjoy Eye of the World. Next up, The Great Hunt is going to go in the same tier as the Eye of the World, but I'm going to put it above Eye of the World because I think in basically all ways, The Great Hunt is a somewhat better book. You know, it's slightly more focused. It's less bloated. Like, I will admit, as much as I love The Eye of the World, it is a little bit long. It's like 300,000 words. And considering what it actually does, I'm not 100% certain that it really needed to be 300,000 words. In comparison, The Great Hunt is what, like 260 something, 270 something thousand words. It's, you know, a few hours at least shorter than The Eye of the World is, and also does a little bit more with its plot. It also introduces us to some of the more cool world building aspects of the series, some things that are just like completely ignored or forgotten about in the rest of the series as certain other developments come to light. But it explores a lot of stuff in really fun and cool ways, and I think that the hunt for the horn, as you know, the title implies, happens in there, is really engaging, and as a follow-up to The Eye of the World, does a great job. It also does a very similar climax to Eye of the World, but does it even better, in my opinion. And so for all of these reasons, I think that The Great Hunt deserves to be above Eye of the World, but it is not one of my favorites. The Dragon Reborn, however, is where we have our first Tavern ranking. It is one of my 3 favorite books in the series. It is my favorite of the first trilogy and remained, you know, tied for my favorite for the rest of the entire series, basically. It's an incredible book. It is also has the benefit, kind of the way that The Great Hunt does compared to Eye of the World, of, you know, doing what it's doing a lot with it, doing it in engaging ways, and also not overdoing anything, because it is, I think, the shortest book in the series outside of, well, I guess books 8 and 9 are both technically shorter than The Dragon Reborn is, but as we'll discuss later, The Dragon Reborn does a lot more with the words that it has going on in there. It is just really good. But the thing that made The Dragon Reborn so interesting to me was that after following our main character in the first 2 books very closely, the third book more or less abandons that direct POV and instead chooses to look at that POV from others' perspectives, including my at the time favorite character, Perrin, and he was a major part of what that book was doing. And I also think that the book is by far one of Robert Jordan's best examples of climaxes within the series. You know, I'm going to mention several climactic sequences here that are either as good as people say, or are very bad, or not as good as people say, or very messy despite me getting what they're going for or whatever. Like, there's a wide variety of quality of climaxes as Robert Jordan wrote them. But The Dragon Reborn is one of his best, and that's not least because just about the entire book is building up towards its actual climactic moment, both in and of itself, but also as a wrap-up to this initial first trilogy, this first arc of the series, and it does so very well. So I always just really loved The Dragon Reborn, and that has not changed in the over 2.5 years since I've read it now. As for The Shadow Rising, there is a little bit of a, you know, it's not a meme per se, but my friends at the time for quite a while liked to meme on me for supposedly really disliking The Shadow Rising, and that is because The Shadow Rising was my first 4-star rating of the series, putting it in the White Cloaks category, where I think it's solid in a lot of ways, and it has a lot of really good material in there, but I also think that it is incredibly overrated within the context of the series. I thought it was overrated at the time, and I think it is arguably even more overrated now. I do think it is a good book, a great book even, and like I said, it does have some great material. The Two Rivers plotline in The Shadow Rising particular is one of the greatest, like, individual story arcs of the entire series, and especially when we think about story arcs that only encompass a single book, the Two Rivers plotline might be the best storyline that only takes place in one book in the entire series. Like, the Shadow Rising has some great stuff in it. In fact, it also manages to evoke some rather emotional moments as well. That Two Rivers storyline includes the one time throughout this series where I actually basically teared up while reading. I'm pretty sure the only time that I can say with, you know, any form of truthfulness that I cried while reading the series was in The Shadow Rising. And so, you know, it's not bad. It's not bad at all. I just also think that there's a lot about it that is a little bit wanting. It is too long. By the time The Shadow Rising happens, Robert Jordan has too much going on and starts to inject too many ideas all at the same time into the book, so as to end up inflating what that book is doing, and so kind of loses a little bit of focus. I don't think there's a very effective climax in The Shadow Rising outside of the Two Rivers plotline. The rest of it is just kind of okay. There's also the fact that there are a couple chapters in there dealing with Ruidian that people say are like arguably the best sequence of the entire series, full stop, and I just thought that they were good. I didn't obviously dislike them at all, but I definitely did not think that they were best scenes of the entire series type of thing. They weren't this world-shattering type of sequence for me personally. And so in a lot of ways, I just kind of felt like I was let down by The Shadow Rising, and the fact that it has the reputation of being potentially the best book in the series, just kind of amongst the broader populace, is something that has always confused me just a little bit, if I'm being completely honest. The Fires of Heaven, however, kind of swings things the other way around and ends up being in Tavern. It is another one of my 3 favorite books within the Wheel of Time, and quite frankly, when it comes to The Fires of Heaven, there are some ways in which it's actually kind of difficult to explain why it's my favorite, because, some of the things that I remember most starkly about it are a little bit more related to the way that other people feel about it. Things like the circus plot line in The Fires of Heaven is quite infamous, and there are a bunch of people who loathe this book because of that plot line and because of the girls, quite frankly, in general. But I loved that material. I loved following that storyline. I loved those characters, and I loved what was going on in it. But I also really loved what was going on with Rand's story and all of that stuff, particularly the ending. I think that The Fires of Heaven, like The Dragon Reborn, has maybe the best climax of any book of the series, arguably. It is up there, There are a couple other books that we'll talk about that are in discussion with it. Obviously, it's in discussion alongside The Dragon Reborn for that, but it really effectively does a lot of things with both Rand and Matt for climactic sequence purposes that are really effective for both of them, and that do a lot of character building, both explicitly and implicitly, in ways that I think genuinely just works, right? The only problem that The Fires of Heaven has that, for me, is going to bring it technically, objectively down, compared to The Dragon Reborn, is the fact that The Fires of Heaven is, also kind of following up on The Shadow Rising, in that by this point in time, Robert Jordan just had too much going on in the series already, but was still wanting to or needing to fit everything in there, so that this is where you start seeing a fairly regular occurrence of entire major POVs and plot lines just being completely excluded from books. In the case of Fires of Heaven, it's not so egregious, and, kind of in some sense makes sense for it to not actually include any of that material in there. It's fine for that particular POV and that particular storyline to not appear. For me, it was also okay because there's a side character within that storyline that I absolutely hate, is one of my least favorite characters I've ever read, period. And so that character not appearing at all in the book is an objectively good thing, in my opinion. But overall, the book, what it is actually doing, what it does have on the page, is just executed so soundly. If you were to ask me, like, what the Wheel of Time is to me, The Fires of Heaven is probably the book that I would point out as, like, that is what defines the series. Also, sorry for that voice crack a sentence or two ago. Nobody noticed, it's fine. But no, like, The Dragon Reborn, I think, is a great book, and also is pretty much the Wheel of Time for me, but, the fact that it lacks a significant chunk of the main character in a POV sense means that it's a little bit, kind of out there for a pick of, a favorite for the series. But The Fires of Heaven, to me, basically defines what the series is at its best when it's firing on all cylinders for the entire book. So that is why it is my favorite, or one of my favorites anyway. Next up, we're going to talk about New Spring, because I decided to read New Spring in between books 5 and 6, a decision that I do not regret in the slightest. I actually actively recommend reading New Spring in between these two books, because for many story and plot reasons, it just kind of makes sense to go back to the prequel at this point in the series, and because of, character, like who New Spring is actually about reasons. If you know, you know. Like, it just makes sense to read it here. But New Spring is going to fit within the Dragonsworn rank. I'm going to include it at the bottom here for now. It is a solid 4.5-star book that I really, really loved. The actual characters that it is primarily exploring are characters that I really, really enjoyed getting to follow, largely because they don't get a whole ton of active screen time in the actual series, and were some of my favorite side characters in general. I don't think it's really spoilers to say that New Spring deals with certain White Tower related stuff and characters in it, and generally speaking, I love a lot of the White Tower stuff within the series, and so New Spring, rolling it back a little bit and going back to the context of, when the Dragon Reborn is born, it just explores that kind of idea, that topic, in a way that I thought was really effective and also really efficient. New Spring is super short. It is the only one of the books in the series that is less than 200,000 words. It's just a short little prequel. It's only like 300 pages. Like, I got through it in just a few days, basically. I plowed right through it. Some of the most efficient and quickest prose that Robert Jordan has ever written, and quite frankly is indicative of probably a style that he should have tried to impart a little bit more in the main series. But the main thing that New Spring does for me is, like, it recontextualizes certain aspects of the characters that it involves, and also it is trying to explore offhand, like the Dragon Reborn, based off of the time that it takes place. And it does all of that in such a way that I'm genuinely, really sad that the rest of this prequel, sort of trilogy idea that Robert Jordan had there wasn't able to be finished, because I really would have liked to see follow-ups to what this was doing with those characters leading up to the time of Eye of the World. I think that a lot of that would have been really, really cool. New Spring was just a taste of what that stuff could have been, and I think that that taste was a really pleasant one. I know New Spring isn't most people's favorites. Me and a particular friend of mine are kind of outliers with really loving this book, but I genuinely really loved New Spring. But following New Spring, we get into where things start to get very complicated with the series for multiple reasons. The Lord of Chaos is not bad. It is a solid 4-star book for me. The main issue with Lord of Chaos is that it is where prose bloat and structural problems start to emerge within the series. Not super offensively bad in either case, in my opinion, but definitely noticeable enough of a problem that it's very clear that there is a problem there. I think the Lord of Chaos has some structural issues in that, I think that the opening act is very good, but then, the second act, especially with Rand's storyline, just does not do anything, just really spins its gears, and then the third act, on account of the non-Rand storyline, actually starts to feel like a first act again instead of a final act. So by the time things are actually leading into the climax, it's like a snap and it suddenly happens moment type of thing. And the end of Lord of Chaos is incredible. People talk about Doom Eyes Wells as being one of the standout moments of the series, and compared to Viridian from The Shadow Rising, I think that Doom Eyes Wells is not overblown or overrated in the slightest. It is genuinely one of the most epic and awesome individual sequences of the series. It's definitely one of the better climaxes of the series. In fact, it might arguably be better than either the Dragon Reborn's or the Fires of Heaven's climaxes. It is that good. But the problem is that Lord of Chaos does have some prose bloat problems that start to become noticeable, and it does have some of those structural issues. I talked about how, the second act doesn't really seem to do anything in Rand's storyline. The third act fails to feel like a third act until all of a sudden the climax is happening, a very common problem for Robert Jordan. This is part of the reason why Shadow Rising is also down here, is because the climax is just kind of, whatever. But, and it is whatever, because it just more or less comes out of nowhere. It just suddenly happens and then it's done in 2.5 seconds. Lord of Chaos does the climax better, but it doesn't do the lead up to it very well. And it also has the problem of mishandled structure with the non-main storyline. You know, we discussed Rand's storyline to some degree, but the other plot lines that are happening in Lord of Chaos, or at least the primary, like the secondary storyline, we'll say, has something going on in the first act that is good, that makes the first act solid. I think it's one of the better first acts of the series. But the second act is where the climax of that secondary storyline happens for some reason, and then the third act of that secondary storyline is the first act of a new subplot line within that storyline with those characters. Sorry for hitting my mic there. And so this is a lot of the reason why Rand's storyline in the final act fails to feel like it's building up towards anything until all of a sudden shit hits the fan, and it is because the other storylines going on at the same time are starting a new storyline rather than ending anything, and so that just makes the overall structure of Lord of Chaos just feel off. And the reason why I said this is where prose bullet problems and structural issues start to emerge is because both of these things get worse as the series goes on. Lord of Chaos is still a solid book in its own right, but it was maybe the worst time that I had with any one of these books for no small amount of time. I understand the people who say that 6 should be part of the slog and 7 shouldn't, because moving on to A Crown of Swords in comparison to Lord of Chaos is still within the White Cloaks tier for me. Yeah, and relatively objectively speaking, yeah, we'll say it's under the Shadow Rising, even though I enjoy Crown of Swords more than Shadow Rising personally. But Shadow Rising is a more sound book structurally than Lord of Chaos is. Lord of Chaos just doesn't fully do what it's doing as well as it should be for the amount of runtime that it has. And A Crown of Swords has the benefit of the massive climax that Lord of Chaos has, and is able to run off of that as a reactionary piece. It spends a lot of time like really focusing on a character perspective, like what the implications of what just happened in Lord of Chaos actually mean for the main character, and a lot of that stuff is really great. You know, people make a lot of fuss about the Bowl of the Winds plotline as well, which, you know, is the plotline that starts at the end of Lord of Chaos that makes its structure feel off. Most of the Bowl of the Winds plotline is in A Crown of Swords and is really good. I actually really like that plotline. I just wish that it all fit in this one book, because it would structurally make a lot more sense if that was the case. The main things that hold A Crown of Swords back from being, you know, say Dragon Sword tier is the fact that its climax is, again, pretty all of a sudden. You're spending a lot of time reflecting upon Lord of Chaos, and then all of a sudden Rand makes a decision, just like, I'm just going to go do this thing now, and then he goes and does that thing without enough, like, you know, build up or anything that makes you feel like you're following along with that until he suddenly does this. Just like, okay, cool, I guess. And like, that is basically that. And the fact that the Bowl of the Winds plotline, which I do really like in how it exists here, but is not contained fully enough the way that it probably should, in my opinion. Moving on to the Path of Daggers is where things get even more complicated for me personally, because I really, really enjoyed the Path of Daggers. Like, reading it was some of the most fun that I've had reading Wheel of Time at all. But thinking about it a little bit more objectively, it's going to go in Dark Friends. It is easily the messiest book in the series up until this point. Of all of the things that I had read, it was the first book to fall below 4 stars for me. I can't remember if I rated it 3 or 4 stars on Goodreads, but I think it's more like a 3.5 star that I round up to 4, maybe, might be how I did it. I forget, I might have rounded it down to 3, but it's like a 3.5 stars. It's the first book that actually goes below 4 stars. And a lot of that is because, again, weird structural decisions. The Bowl of the Winds plotline ends at the very beginning of this book. So this book starts with a climax, which is very whiplashy and weird. And then the climax of this book, like of what this book is actually doing with Rand's plotline, is a little bit strange. It's a little bit different. You know, it shows a different side to what's going on with him and his character, and also with, like, how he's actually feeling as a person, and it showcases that in some interesting ways. I just don't think that the climax very effectively showed what it was doing, even though I like what it was trying to do from a fundamental level. What the problem with Path of Daggers is that it is missing one of the major storylines, first of all. And that major storyline being missing following the end of Crown of Swords just feels super weird. I don't feel like that was the right decision to make there. The problems with Rand's climax just being, again, kind of strange and not executed as well as I think they probably ought to have been to be as effective as Jordan wanted them to be. And then the fact that it starts off with the climax to a plot line that has been going on for a book and a half at this point is, again, a really weird structural decision. These structural problems definitely make Path of Daggers one that's like, this is just kind of a mess. I really like it. I really like that book, but it is, objectively speaking, a mess. So it definitely goes in dark, friends. Book 9 is where I'm going to have some people throwing pitchforks at me. Winter's Heart is the one book in the series that I think I just don't really like. And that is for reasons that I've tried my best to explain in a handful of videos at this point, but I'll do my best to summarize it here. I don't love Winter's Heart because of two particular reasons. The first one is because the first half of it is really, really rough. You know, part of what makes like Path of Daggers really fun for me is even though I really dislike one of the side characters associated with Perrin's plotline, I really like Perrin as a character, and I especially like Perrin getting to observe other people as characters. And Perrin gets to do that in Path of Daggers. He gets to observe Rand. He gets to be an outside perspective on Rand's character, rather than us being in Rand's head during that time. It's something that I really loved in The Dragon Reborn as well. And so we get to view that through Perrin's eyes in the Path of Daggers, and then Perrin gets set on a task by Rand that he has to just go out and do now. And, well, he does that in Crown of Swords, actually, come to think. And then Path of Daggers is where he actually goes to the spot to go do that task. So I had some of the structure of that a little bit messed up. I think that's part of the reason why I do like Crown of Swords better than Lord of Chaos, is because of that perspective thing that I just talked about. But in either case, the actual technical details of the structure doesn't really matter. The problem with Winter's Heart is that following the way that Perrin's storyline ends in Path of Daggers, the first like 6 chapters of Winter's Heart is 6 out of like 30 chapters for a 220,000 word book. Those first 6 chapters are quite frankly abysmal, because they do not do anything that the end of Path of Daggers did not already like kind of make very clear or obvious or imply. And then they proceed to continue going and doing nothing new. They basically say, oh yeah, this just happened at the end of the Path of Daggers, and now we're going to go deal with that problem. And that is pretty much the one-sentence summary of what happens in those entire 6 chapters. They are easily the 6 most useless chapters in the entire series. The prologue of Winter's Heart isn't particularly compelling either, and the rest of the first half deals with storylines that are just kind of not doing a whole lot either. Like, they're just kind of all turning their gears at this point, not actually making any forward progress or momentum. And so the first half of Winter's Heart is just a struggle. You know, it's not an uncommon thing to hear about people talk about Winter's Heart in this context of like, yeah, the first half is kind of rough in some ways, but the back half is really good, you know, one of the best endings of the series. And I'm the one guy who's going to tell you that it is not one of the best endings of the series, in my humble opinion. Because by the time we finally get through the first half of the book, it's just like, okay, we're not dealing with any of that stuff anymore. What do we have to look forward to? Cool, Rand and Matt POVs? Let's go. These storylines are always consistently pretty decent. Let's go with it. And they have really good buildups. You know, I would say like the third quarter of both of these books, or of both of those plot lines within Winter's Heart, really, really solid building up towards the ending. Especially Rand's, because it's building up towards an event that we've kind of been like looking towards for a couple of books now. both of these plot lines have bad climaxes. Matt's climax is bad because it ends partway through. You have a climactic moment that it ends on, which is cool, but if you look at the climax overall, it's just like, this did not actually do the entire sequence of events that it promised me it was going to do. It just kind of stopped. That really bothers me personally. And then Rand's plot line, the climax fundamentally should be really awesome. There's a lot of really good and important material that is happening there. Like, from a broader series perspective, it is a really, really important event. I just didn't feel like it was that important while reading it. I think Winter's Heart does basically the same thing that Path of Daggers climax does, but it also manages to do it worse. They share the problems of showing scenes that don't actually matter contextually, like none of those scenes actually really matter. There's maybe a couple of them you can point to and be like, okay, that little bit of information, like this particular character meeting this particular fate, that's probably good to know for the future, so we're not going to see them anymore, for example. But like outside of like a couple of brief spurts of that within the last chapter of Winter's Heart, none of the rest of that climax showed anything that I wanted to see, and any of the scenes that were occurring, you could more or less bet on not actually making any effective difference within the context of the scene. Like you weren't exploring any of what he was doing and being excited about what the next scene was going to show you. It was just like, okay, here's the things that happened during this sequence, I guess. And that was basically it. So I just found myself very annoyed by Matt's ending because it didn't actually finish the climax. This is something that I famously really dislike about a couple of the climaxes of The Dark Tower by Stephen King. The Wastelands ending really pisses me off because it stops halfway through the climax to the point that the rest of the climax is done at the very beginning of book 4 for some reason. Winter's Heart very nearly does a similar thing where Matt's climax just kind of stops, and then the first couple chapters of Matt's POV in the next book literally summarize for you. This is how the rest of the climax in the last book went, by the way. Just show that in the book. And then Rand's plot line ended in a way that I personally found incredibly disappointing. So you have a first half of the book that is just not good, you know? Maybe to some degree it's not terrible. Like, it's not something that I absolutely loathed to some degree. I disliked the parent and stuff for sure. But the first half of this book in general is just not good, and the back half is incredibly disappointing because I think that both of the climaxes were botched. So that's definitely a me thing. Like, don't let my opinion of Winter's Heart ending bother you, because most other people think that this is one of the better endings of the series. Maybe that's just because it's in the middle of the slog arc, and so it being like semi-decent means that people really like it a lot more than maybe it actually deserves. I don't know. But for me, Winter's Heart is the one book of the series that I like arguably just straight up dislike. I think I rate this like 2.5 stars. Like, it is there right on the border between being like, it's decent, I guess, but really what it comes down to is like the third quarter of Rand's and Matt. The third quarter of the book with Rand's and Matt's plotline specifically are good. The rest of it I'm not into. So that's a me thing again, but yeah, Winter's Heart is the dark one for me. It is my least favorite book of the series. Sorry, not sorry. Next up, Crossroads of Twilight. Again, this is going to be, maybe not like the hottest take in the world. It's going to be at the bottom of Dark Friends here, below Path of Daggers, because pretty objectively speaking, it is, again, kind of a mess, and it is a mess because of massive prose bloat problems and certain structural issues. But I also think that Crossroads of Twilight is not anywhere near as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. I've met plenty of people who make this out to be like a legitimately terrible book that was completely undeserving of being published, and I disagree. Maybe that's just because I understand what it was that Robert Jordan was trying to do with it from a structural level. Most of what this book is doing is reacting to the end of Winter's Heart, because again, on a storyline level, the end of Winter's Heart is a massive, massive moment for the rest of the series, and that's part of why I think I was disappointed by it, was because I didn't feel like it was actually that massive of a moment while reading it. But objectively speaking, that moment is very massive and has huge implications for stuff. And so it is a big enough moment in the series that literally every other storyline has to acknowledge that this happened. So Crossroads of Twilight fixes some structural issues with the series that have been appearing within the timeline of stuff going on. It more or less centralizes all the storylines together, and but says like, hey, all these storylines are happening now basically at the same time, whereas for the last couple of books there was enough space in between some stuff where it's just like you don't actually really know what's happening when, and in some cases that becomes a problem. Crossroads of Twilight basically recentralizes all of that. And it also, like I said, it focuses primarily on reacting to the end of Winter's Heart and then looking forwards towards, what is inevitably going to be coming soon, and that is basically the last battle. It's looking forward into book 11, which is itself like the final stage of this pre-last battle type of stuff. Like, okay, we got to wrap up what we've got going on right now, and then it's last battle time, baby. And Crossroads of Twilight does a decent job reacting to the end of book 9 as the massive moment it is, and then looking forward and being like, okay, all of these storylines are here in these spots. They have these goals that they're aiming towards right now. We're going to get through those goals. We're going to do those things in the next book, and then we're going to be good. I think that genuinely, like structurally speaking, it was an interesting way to go about the book, and I don't think it would have been bad at all if there weren't some of the structural issues that it has, and of course the prose bloat problems. I think that Crossroads of Twilight would have been much better if all of the POVs just happened one after the other, just from beginning to end, POV, 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 and then be done. But Robert Jordan tried to make the last 1 or 2 chapters of every POV happen all at the end. So you had like one story, one story, one story, one story, one story, and then like one chapter from each of those stories at the very end. And it just didn't make sense to structure it that way at all. Those chapters should have just been with their POV when they happened earlier in the book. And then, of course, words needed to be cut. Like Crossroads of Twilight should have been as few words or even shorter than Path of Daggers was, but somehow manages to be as long as The Great Hunt was. And that's kind of inexcusable. I understand that. That's why it is at the bottom of Dark Friends here, is because there are problems with Crossroads of Twilight. I just don't think it's a terrible book, actually. So, that's where it's going to go. The real hot take after all of these other hot takes that I've already discussed in this series so far, is that Knife of Dreams is also going to go in Dark Friends. That's because Knife of Dreams is a solid 3.5 stars that I rounded up to 4 stars, mind you. But Knife of Dreams is also, again, kind of like Shadow Rising. I think it is overrated within the context of the series. I think people... it's also kind of like Winter's Heart in that way as well. I think that people overrate the ending of Winter's Heart because it's within the context of this slower section of the series that is rougher and structured poorly. And so you have material in the back half of Winter's Heart that is actually pretty solid, more akin to stuff from earlier in the series. And people are like, yeah, that's awesome. And so they like rate it more highly in their head because it's within the context of the stuff that's a little bit worse. Knife of Dreams basically does the same thing because it finally closes off this storyline arc that happens from book 7 through 11. But when you realize that book 7 through 11 could very well have been a trilogy instead of 5 books, Knife of Dreams is very nearly a too little too late kind of thing. The back half of Knife of Dreams is incredible. The prologue of Knife of Dreams is really good, but I think that it's that way because I really like the White Tower stuff. The White Tower stuff in Knife of Dreams is really great. But overall as a book, it kind of suffers... it suffers part of the same problem of Winter's Heart in that the first half, outside of its prologue, the first half of Knife of Dreams is still really rough. It very much follows after the pacing of Crossroads of Twilight, and a couple of those storylines, Matt's storyline and Elaine's storyline quite notably, in both Crossroads of Twilight and throughout the first half of Knife of Dreams, are just really, really spinning their gears and making no progress, but spending a lot of words trying to do what they're doing. Perrin's storyline is very much the same thing, just both of these two characters. Elaine and Perrin in particular, I think, are like the main word count of no small amount of the slog arc, but they somehow make the least active forward momentum progress within their stories in the entire arc. So it's just kind of baffling because the amount of words that could have been cut from those two storylines alone without losing any material at all, without losing any important material at all, is, again, it's just kind of baffling. And then Matt's storyline in Knife of Dreams as well also kind of follows the same problem in the first half, in that it's like, okay, we've literally just been through all this information in the last book. Can we just get on with it now? And then the back half happens, and the back half is great. It closes off the arc. It closes off this little arc of the trilogy. It climaxes all of the major storylines, have a good, effective ending point in Knife of Dreams, whereas the structure of all of these past handful of books have been really rough. There's a reason why books 6 through 11 are all in the bottom half of the series here. It's because structurally speaking, they are all pretty much just kind of a mess. 11 like closes that loop and makes them so they're not a mess anymore, which is really great. But again, it's really hampered by the first half. I think that first half really, really hurts it. And again, it very much borders on being too little too late, so that even though I do really enjoy the back half of it, it doesn't feel as substantial as it should because it took way too long to get there. So I understand why people really like Knife of Dreams. It is a lot better than the previous 3 books are in a lot of ways, but I also had more fun with Path of Daggers, for example, and it shares some of the problems of Crossroads of Twilight. I just cannot justify giving it a full 4 stars and putting it up in White Cloaks here. Like, Lord of Chaos at this point is kind of lucky that it does not get demoted a little bit because of it introducing some structural problems. The thing that keeps Lord of Chaos better is that its solid moments are so good that I can't justify putting it any lower, you know? Like, how could the book with Doom Eyes Wells be in Dark Friends? I can't do that. But for the same reason, how can the book that wastes like 50,000 words in the first half of the book alone be in White Cloaks? Like, I just can't do that. So yeah, there's that. Moving on, let's get into the Brando Sando arc of the trilogy, where things take a stark upswing, we'll say. Gathering Storm is in the Tavern section. We're going to put it... The ranking of the Tavern section is honestly really, like... You could do whatever you want with these 3, and any of those rankings are correct for me. The technicalities of what separates these, and as good as they are, is very minute. Like, The Dragon Reborn, I think, is arguably the strongest book because there's nothing about it that's like missing or done wrong, really, to any notable degree. The Gathering Storm has a particular timeline issue where you can tell that there's at least a sequence of scenes that is supposed to happen that does not happen because of the way that the timeline between The Gathering Storm and Towers of Midnight are, so that there's like a portion of this book that is like technically missing because that scene happens in the other book because it's a different storyline, because it's different main characters, stuff that doesn't happen in this book that's not the focus of this book. Like, you understand why that decision was made, and The Gathering Storm is not made worse because of it, but it is like one solid whiplashy moment there approaching the end of the book that is like, okay, that's weird. So in that sense, it is like technically slightly lower than Dragon Reborn. And then I guess Fires of Heaven ends up being the lowest of these 3 within the context of the tier list, probably just because I remember the least about it actively as far as like the storylines go. Like, I could give you a very solid rundown of both of what both of these 2 books are doing if I wanted to, but this one kind of molds and is a little bit more vague in my memory at this point, so I guess that's what this order is about. But again, it doesn't really matter. The point is, Gathering Storm is a top 3 Wheel of Time book. It is incredible. It does everything well, and following, the end of the Slog arc, it actually starts building up towards the end of the series. It makes the imminence of the last battle actually feel imminent, actually feel like something that's coming soon rather than just something that's vaguely on the horizon way over there or something. It's like actually going to be happening soon. It does very good at all of that stuff, and quite frankly, it does some really interesting things as far as its main storylines are going, or as as far as its main storyline, whatever. The English is difficult. I've been recording this video for over 50 minutes. I didn't expect it to be this long, so forgive me. Rand's storyline in The Gathering Storm is really, really well done, because instead of having a battle-related type of climax, it's more of a character-related climax, and those moments feel very rewarding. After several books, felt like Rand kind of basically borderline stagnated, like he wasn't actually changing or experiencing anything that was changing him in any way. I feel like Rand's arc kind of pauses near the end, or around the end and beginning of, well, I guess he does continue to go through arc and Path of Daggers, but by the time you get to Winter's Heart, Crossroads Twilight, and Knife of Dreams, like, Rand doesn't really change basically at all, and Gathering Storm finally sees his arc actually make some moves again. It also, builds on some of the thematic related stuff of his arc, reintroduces some of the themes of what his storyline is trying to explore, that of being the chosen one, but not really wanting to be the chosen one, but accepting that role, and what do you do when you are the chosen one? Gathering Storm actually makes those questions relevant again. And then The Gathering Storm also has a really great White Tower storyline going on following these previous two books. And that, honestly, like, the White Tower stuff, quite frankly, all of the Aes Sedai and White Tower stuff from books 5 through 11 is probably my favorite extended plotline of the series. So that's probably no small part of why I love these two books so much, is because of all that. But yeah, the White Tower storyline is also incredible in The Gathering Storm. So between all of those things, and the fact that it doesn't have any flaws, the fact that it gets the prose back up to snuff, the fact that the pace is picked up, the fact that the way that chapters and POVs and stuff are structured is a little bit more intentional, not wasting any time compared to the last 5 books. Gathering Storm is just a big step up, and it reminded me of why I loved the first half of the series. I really loved a lot of this first half of the series here, and it reminded me of that. How I said earlier about how The Fires of Heaven is like the book that defines Wheel of Time for me? The Gathering Storm is probably the second book that defines the Wheel of Time for me. These two are up there as like that, like, if you want a solid idea of what the series actually looks like fundamentally when it is firing on all cylinders and doing what it is doing, generally speaking, at its best, these two books do that. And so that's why they're up in my favorites. Towers of Midnight, however, brings us back down to the White Cloaks tier. We're going to put it in between books 7 and 6 here, and that's because Towers of Midnight, despite having a lot of great content that I really, really like in a lot of ways, is structurally very unsound. I kind of talked about with Gathering Storm, there's like a portion of like the story there where you feel like there's things missing from it. That is because those things happen in Towers of Midnight. Why is this decision made? Well, Gathering Storm and Towers of Midnight are basically one book that had to be split into 2, and so the arc of The Gathering Storm was basically just getting Rand through his personal character arc, and getting the White Tower through its major plot arc of that book, and basically everything else was sidelined so that it could be done in Towers of Midnight instead. I agree with almost all of the decisions made in that way, but Perrin's storyline in particular is very mishandled in my opinion. I think that there are some of Perrin's scenes in Towers of Midnight that could have been repurposed to be included in The Gathering Storm so that the timeline issues wouldn't be so whiplashy and problematic, because what it comes down to it, Towers of Midnight's biggest weakness, basically its only real weakness, is that the timeline is hardcore borked. Like, it is absolutely just, to say it's messy would be an understatement. It is unfathomable that some of the structural decisions were made here. There's a certain degree to which I understand it, and I know that you couldn't really do much different. It was relatively unavoidable the way that these two books needed to be split in order for Perrin's timeline to catch up to everything within this book more effectively. But again, I think that some of his character moments here could have been repurposed in scenes that could have been done in The Gathering Storm instead. And then his storyline should have front-loaded a lot of Towers of Midnight to get it mostly caught up, whereas it takes until like halfway through before Brandon actually tries to catch his story up to everybody else. So you have a lot of moments within Towers of Midnight that are defined by the whiplash that you feel, where a certain scene of some other POVs are happening and a reference is made to something of like Perrin's timeline, or something in Perrin's timeline references what's going on in Rand's or Matt's storyline for reasons that you know if you know. And when those references occur, you're genuinely having to sit there and think for a solid like 30 or 60 seconds and being like, okay, is that referencing this moment from this book? Or is that referencing this moment from like the beginning of the last book? That is how bad the timeline mismatch is between Perrin and literally everybody else in Towers of Midnight. And although I get that some of that could not be avoided in this book, and I'm very forgiving of that, I gave the book 4 stars. You know, if I was being really ornery about this, I would rate the book and rank it lower on account of this really massive structural problem. But what it comes down to is I am very forgiving of it. I do think that it could have been handled better, though, and that's the thing that really holds the book back. It absolutely would be in Dragonsworn, like no questions asked, if a lot of Perrin's material within the Towers of Midnight was in the first half of the book instead of the back half of the book. Like there's a lot of what happens in the middle of it, like the third quarter of it, basically, that should have occurred throughout the first half of it rather than the third quarter of it, so that it wouldn't feel like whiplash, because you get a lot of whiplash reading this book. That is the problem with it. So that's where that falls. I wish it was higher. Like I genuinely wish it was higher. I like this book a lot more than where it is placed here. But that's just how it goes. I like the material of what is in here a lot more than this rating suggests. But like I said, it's very structurally not sound. A Memory of Light, however, we're going to move back up into the A tier, and we're going to stick this at the top of the A tier. Come on, move out of the way, Great Hunt. Yeah, A Memory of Light for a hot second was actually making me debate what I was going to do with Tavern, because I had basically structured what this tier list, what these rankings were going to look like here, leading up to the last book. Like I was like a week away from actually reading A Memory of Light when I built this, tier list. Basically, it was like, okay, Tavern is going to be my 3 favorites. That's going to be Dragon Reborn, Gathering Storm, Fires of Heaven, most likely. We'll see what A Memory of Light does. Fingers crossed that it doesn't hurt my head too much. But then I finished the book and I was like, man, does this go in the top 3 favorites? If it does go in Tavern, what of these 3 books do I down to Dragonsworn? And the truth is that I cannot make myself bring any of these 3 down. I just can't do it. And after reading some bonus material, that some of the cut content from Memory of Light, I actually found myself noting a couple of particular issues with it that I personally had, like not issues per se, more so just very minor disappointments that I don't have with my 3 favorite books. None of these 3 books have minor disappointments in them for me. Like there's a tiny bit of whiplash here, there's a slight bit of annoyance with one particular character here, and there's the fact that one storyline is just missing here, but I wasn't missing that storyline because I was happy to not deal with that particular side character. So I was not actually personally disappointed with anything in my 3 favorite books, whereas A Memory of Light is nigh perfect, but has a couple very minute, very small things that are just slightly disappointing. It is an incredibly impressive book in every way, shape, and form. Like, if you want to know more about how I feel about this book specifically, I just did my review for it like a week and a half ago, and in there I talk more specifically about what about it impresses me. It is a very impressive book that very nearly ended up in my top 3 favorites, but ever so slightly doesn't. 5 stars. It is the top of the A tier here. It is the top of the 4.5 to 5 star tier here, very deserving of this spot. But because it has the unique feature compared to these three of having an aspect or two that I'm very slightly disappointed by, it goes in the A tier instead. So that is this is my tier list for the main series. For reference, all of the books in their ratings, Winter's Heart is 2.5 stars. I would say Crossroads of Twilight is 3 stars. Path of Daggers and Knife of Dreams, I think, are probably both 3.5 stars. This one I think I just rated down because of its messiness, and this one I rated up because the quality of the back half is worth, rounding it up to 4, instead of down to 3, because this isn't a 3-star book. It's not that messy. But it is 3.5, so it is down here. Lord of Chaos and all 4 of these books are just straight up 4 stars. The White Cloaks tier was just straight up 4-star books. New Spring and Eye of the World are 4.5 stars. That I rounded up to 5, mind you. So that's also something worth noting. And then The Great Hunt all the way up to Dragon Reborn here. All these 5 books I would give 5 stars. So yeah, that is my tier list. But you'll notice there is one image down here. This was, the artist who did the art for all of the series up until A Memory of Light. This was his in-progress work for A Memory of Light's cover until he passed away while he was working on it. And then Michael Whalen was done to do the actual final cover for the book. Why do I have this image here? Well, this image here is a technicality. This is like a collective of the side material, basically. But what I'm going to go ahead and do with this is we'll say that it is the cut content from A Memory of Light, specifically the cut content. Notably, that is River of Souls and A Fire Within the Ways. River of Souls is canon and is a short story's worth sequence of scenes that deal with a particular character and people that appear at one point within A Memory of Light. And it was cut from this book because of pacing and focus reasons. A Fire Within the Ways is not canon and is actually an alternate version of some of the things that you see within A Memory of the Light, and also includes some material that is not included in A Memory of Light at all. It's hard to talk about without getting into spoilers specifically. But this is what I meant by there was some of the bonus material of the series that, upon reading it, made me retroactively slightly disappointed in A Memory of Light. Because while reading it, I was already slightly disappointed by the fact that the ways just don't really make an appearance there. They're very much promised to be something that are going to make an appearance. You definitely get the impression that they're going to be important in the book. And then they just don't really do anything. That is because A Fire Within the Ways was the scene, or the sequence of scenes rather, that was going to be dealing with that, and ended up being cut because it wasn't quite working the way that it needed to. And I understand why that was the case. The problem with A Fire Within the Ways is that I think that the way it handled the ways is actually really, really intelligent and smart. And also, there are certain things that are repurposed from A Fire Within the Ways that are actually in the final book in different ways, in different scenes, in different moments. All of the repurposed content is better within A Fire Within the Ways, and because A Fire Within the Ways actually deals with the ways, one of the things that I really wanted to see more of in this final book, I was kind of disappointed that material isn't there. I'm made even more disappointed by the fact that it wasn't there, because I do think it was actually possible to make A Fire Within the Ways work within the context of the story. It just would have taken probably way more work than it was worth. That's why it was not included in the final book. So I'm just kind of missing it. I wish that it had ended up happening anyway. That's a little bit of a personal thing. And then River of Souls, that canon sequence of stories that I'd said before that was cut from the book for pacing and focus reasons, makes sense. I understand why. But River of Souls is really good, and I think should absolutely be read, to the degree that if it had been conceived and thought of during the writing of Towers of Midnight, I think that River of Souls would work incredibly well spread out in Towers of Midnight, because I think that the act of foreshadowing it does for a particular character and people in A Memory of Light is important enough to the series that it shouldn't be skipped. So I think that it should have been in here if it had been hindsight 2020 and all. But otherwise, I think that it should be read before A Memory of Light. That's how important I think it is. But between these two bits of cut content, which I think are substantial enough to include in conversation with the rest of the series, I'm going to go ahead and put them here at the bottom of the Dragonsworn section, because Fire Within the Waves I gave 4.5 out of 5 stars. It's a little bit messy in some spots because obviously it wasn't final. It was ultimately just a bunch of cut scenes from the book. But I really liked Fire Within the Waves and think that it should have been part of the book instead. And I think that had that ended up working out to whatever degree it worked out, Memory of Light might well not have had that particular aspect of disappointment that would have caused it to not be top 3. It might well have managed to be top 3. I don't know, just speaking hypothetically here. But the main thing is that River of Souls is 5 stars and I think is really good and I think is super worth reading. So I'm going to say that that bonus material here, as indicated by this unused cover for the series, is also going to be in the 4.5 to 5 star range up top here, because that's what I rated both those stories, was 4.5 to 5 stars. So there you have it. But over an hour into this video now, that is the tier list. So we're going to take this tier list here and we're going to go ahead and pop it over on that side of the screen as a list of the books from top to bottom, favorite to least favorite, as implied by this list, basically. Winter's Heart down below, then this, then this, then this, so on and so forth. Basically, from bottom to top, we're going to exclude this bonus material from the list proper. But let's just say that this here is the list over there. This is what the tier list says that my ranking of the Wheel of Time is. Let's carry that back over to this screen and put that over there, basically. And now we're going to go over what my actual list, what my actual ranking of the series is from a more proper favorite to least favorite way. First, we're going to truncate all of the, names to their abbreviations over there. And now we're going to go from bottom to top of my personal ranking. Winter's Heart goes at the bottom. Crossroads of Twilight just above that. So the bottom two ranks are the same. The Shadow Rising is in 13th place, so this is a huge drop-off from where it is in the tier list side of things, because again, I think it's a great book, but I just didn't particularly connect with it. Knife of Dreams goes above The Shadow Rising. Actually, that might be a little bit of a snub. If we're being honest, Knife of Dreams should probably be below The Shadow Rising. But in fairness, I will explain this placement here. It is the reason why Shadow Rising is so low, relatively speaking, is because even though it has some great material, even though it has the Two Rivers plotline that's going on, there was the one time throughout this entire series that I seriously considered DNFing, that I legitimately wondered and had to talk with one of my friends, like, is this series worth pushing through if I am having this much issue with this particular side character? I hate this character. They're pissing me off. I'm actually miserable reading some of these scenes. Why am I doing this to myself? Like I said, the one book that I considered DNFing in the series was The Shadow Rising. So despite the good that it does, despite the great material that it contains, despite the fact that it is at the top of my B tier ranking from the tier list, it is 13th place because it was the book that I actively struggled the most with outside of Crossroads of Twilight and Winter's Heart, but those books I struggled with for very different reasons. The Shadow Rising was just the one book that I considered DNFing the series with, and so I can't personally rank it any higher than this. So that's why Knife of Dreams is above Shadow Rising. But above Knife of Dreams is going to be Lord of Chaos in 11th place. The Path of Daggers in 10th place, a ranking that it might be a little bit surprising, but I genuinely just had so much fun with Path of Daggers. Above that is going to be A Crown of Swords, and A Crown of Swords is interestingly placed here because, quite frankly, I think that Path of Daggers and Crown of Swords are basically interchangeable, depending on what it is we're talking about. If we're talking about their more objective quality, I think A Crown of Swords is better than Path of Daggers, but I had more fun reading Path of Daggers, so, those two are interchangeable. Towers of Midnight goes above A Crown of Swords. And then we get into the A and S tiers, which are all consistently the first 7 again. They're just in a slightly different order for the most part. New Spring is in the same position in 7th place, but then it's The Great Hunt and The Eye of the World above that. And this ranking I'm also going to explain a little bit. I rate The Great Hunt 5 out of 5. I rate The Eye of the World 4.5 out of 5. I think that The Great Hunt is the better book, but I remember The Eye of the World more fondly for whatever reason. I just enjoyed that book slightly more. I think The Great Hunt is better, but I just enjoyed The Eye of the World more. So again, it's kind of a similar thing to Path of Daggers and Crown of Swords. And you know what? I'm actually going to go ahead and retroactively change that. I think Path of Daggers is going to go above a Crown of Swords for me, just because I did have more fun with that. Just from a, personal taste sense, I think that it is worth noting that that is in my memory just more what I wanted. But anyway, going back to the top 5 here, Eye of the World is in 5th place. A Memory of Light is still 4th place. It is going to be in that same place there. And then my top 3, I'm going to order slightly different for the purposes of my personal ranking compared to the tier list. Dragon Reborn is going to go at the bottom of the ranking because if A Memory of Light had forced anything out, I think the Dragon Reborn might have been the one that it forced out, even if just barely. It would have been like ripping teeth out to make that decision, but it's probably the decision that I would have made. And then The Gathering Storm is going to stay in 2nd place, and The Fires of Heaven is going to be in 1st place instead. But again, as we kind of discussed in the tier list portion of the video, those top 3 are basically interchangeable. So that is my ranking side by side with the tier list, and you can kind of see where some of those interesting changes occur. For the most part, it's just a little bit of interesting swaps in a couple of places. There are some spots where the ranking is basically the same, Winter's Heart, Crossroads of Twilight, same spots, Knife of Dreams, Lord of Chaos are the same. But then you have a couple of minor swaps within the top 3, and then within the next 4 after that. It is mostly ranks 8 through 12 where you it's mostly just ranks like 8 through 13 where you see just a little bit of weirdness, where ranks 10 and 13 just end up being a little bit higher, and then 8 and 9 are just a little bit lower for reasons that don't particularly make sense. But yeah, so that is the comparison. Just kind of see for yourself what that looks like, and be mad at me about it in the comments below, I guess. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and close this video with that slight discussion that I hinted at earlier on at the beginning, even though this video is very long. I do intend to make another video about the Wheel of Time at some point this year, and it's going to be somewhat similar to this one, but instead of going over my personal rankings of the series, which this video obviously did, I intend to go over some of your guys' ratings of the series instead. And what I want to do is I want to basically make it like an internet ranks Wheel of Time video or something along those lines, where I'm going to compile some various different data sets from different places to basically get an overview of how the broader series ranks amongst the general audience online in a somewhat more, offhand manner. It's going to be balancing various different things into that ranking. I don't know what the video is going to look like yet, but for obvious reasons, this video isn't going to be able to cover that because it would be too long. But basically what that's going to entail is taking the average ratings of each of the books from Goodreads. It's going to take my personal friends' ratings specifically on Goodreads and take those into account as its own data set, because I have a ton of friends on Goodreads who have read through the whole series, and so that'll make some very interesting data. I'm going to take my close friends from Discords, their rankings of the series, not just their ratings of the individual books, but their rankings of the series. I'm going to take, probably at some point over the next handful of months, I'm going to go ahead and do some polls on both Reddit and Facebook, maybe a couple other places as well in different groups, and try to get some rankings in one of those polls, basically asking people to give their rankings in comments of a particular section, but there's also going to be like a degree to which I'll probably do like elimination polls, basically ask people for their favorite, remove the favorite, and then do the remainder in another poll and continue doing that until there's only a couple left, and that way you're like doing elimination style favorites, sort of like brackets basically, but just kind of one matchup at a time. So there's some polls like that I want to run. Obviously my rankings, as expressed in this video, both of them are going to be taken into account, and I also want to hear your guys' rankings of the series. You can of course comment them, but I would prefer if you guys used the Google form that is going to be included in the description and the pinned comment of this video. And the reason why I would like you to use that form is so that I can get basically my audience's opinions on the series specifically, like your guys' data set apart from everybody else's data, and in that way then I can have like a broad swath of data points that I can use to kind of develop an idea of what the internet broadly thinks about the series. Of course it's still going to be very limited data set, still going to be very limited a ranking in that sense, but it's going to be a lot more comprehensive than say my list is. My ranking, for example, is absolutely not objective. I'm not saying that it is, and it is going to differ vastly. I know it differs vastly from just about everybody else's possible, so I'm curious to see just what the more general data actually looks like compared to just like the impression of, oh, this book is one of the best, or oh, this one is one of the best, or anything like that. I want to like actually know which ones a certain portion of the internet actually thinks are the best and worst, and how different that is. So that will probably be a video that I do at some point later in the year, like I said. But for now, this is my last coverage of my personal opinion dedicated of the series. There are some topics that I might cover at some point in the future, like I might do a ranking of the main characters of the series, for example, at some point. But all things considered, might as well just say that from a reviewing perspective, from a critic perspective, this is where my time with the series is basically done. So it's yeah, that's a bittersweet moment. It's been 3 years and half a month later. I have basically finished with the series and all of my primary coverage of it. Thank you for being along for the ride if you are somebody who has been. It really means a lot to me. But for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC. This video was way too long, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.